So again, going back to this as being descriptive terms, this is really the key difference, and that was what I was getting to when I just started recording between a student who's getting a 2 or 3 on this assignment, because I know that the photo's about line and it may have some really good lines in it, but when you write this up, you have to be as descriptive as you can. And so that's the main lesson for this. Since this is a Criterion A assignment, and I'll get to it explaining it a little bit more, um, when you choose a line photo, part of it is identifying a photo where line is a strong element. The other part is describing what you see. So if you just say that if there's a line's strong in this photo, that I use line, that's a 2 or a 3. If you start to use these terms, it's a horizontal line, well, now you're getting a little bit closer. But you want to get a bit more descriptive about how that horizontal line is being used, where it's placed in the frame. Is it thick? Is it thin? Is it dotted? Is it implied? A line doesn't always need to be a straight line. It could be dotted, or it could be objects that are in a line. There's a lot of ways that you could use line. Shape is two-dimensional. That's the thing that you need to remember between shape and form. Shape are two-dimensional shapes that you see in the photograph. And again, they're not things that you can touch. So when we do get to three-dimensional, there's ways that you can show that. But like if you saw circles or triangles or rectangles, and that's a strong element in this particular photograph, just remember that shape is two-dimensional. And then again, what shapes are seen? What are you noticing? And the one good way to break up a shape, to identify what type of shape it is it a geometric shape or is it organic? So organic shape, a good example would be, say, a leaf, right? A leaf is not a geometric shape. It might have balance, and that's over here on principles of design, not elements of design. We'll talk about that later. But it's something found in nature, and that may be really important. The two-dimensional shapes that you see in nature are just as interesting as the geometric shapes you see in more person-made structures or graphics or whatnot. So for example, someone said that they are really interested in architectural photography. In that, you might see a lot of geometric shapes on the surface of a building, how they design a window or break up the building using struts or the outer surface of the building. And again, these are all two-dimensional functions. The difference between shape and form is that form is three-dimensional. So when you are seeing a two-dimensional photograph of a three-dimensional object, it's a lot like when you're drawing an object, trying to give it some depth. How you light an object, and then we'll do this in this class. We'll practice this a lot in one of the assignments. How you light an object, how you place an object, how you reveal the form by taking a picture is all about how you capture the fact that this object, even though it's represented on a two-dimensional image, is in fact a three-dimensional object. So again, lighting and shading play a really strong role in being able to reveal form when you're using photography. Color, I like the British spelling, but we don't spell it with a U, really refers to color properties of a photograph. One way you can talk about color is the warmth or the coolness of the color, the tone, the tint, the shade. And then there's another tool that I wanted to introduce when we talked about color, and I wanted to share that resource with you because it's kind of a cool one. Texture in photography is really about what you imply. So in photography, it's called an implied texture. You can't actually touch a photograph, but when you take a photograph of a texture, you can imagine what that would feel like. And again, you've already done this in Photo 1, where we had to do texture photographs. I think it was 20 of them. And people are really good at doing that. And texture photographs are the kinds of photographs that make really good backgrounds, backgrounds for web pages, backgrounds for cards, I use a lot of texture photos for the background for my cell phone when I cycle through, because they're consistent and they give you a sense of what that surface might look like or might feel like. Space, this one's a bit tricky. Our next project is going to talk a lot about space, because you're going to have a lot more control about what's in the space and how you use the space than you normally do. One of the easiest ways to kind of describe and talk about space is to talk about negative and positive space. And so in this case, you either see two people or you see a glass. And the negative and the positive space are interacting with each other. And in photography, You know, you're creating a negative space a lot to put emphasis on a particular subject. But I don't think that that's all there is to it. I think that when you talk about space, you're really talking about how that space is being used, not just in terms of positive or negative, but words like, is it cluttered? Is it clean? You know, sometimes there's a lot of things in your frame, you know, or is it simple? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about space. And then value is really darkness or lightness of a color. It has a lot to do with the range of different shades of color that you might see in a photograph. And again, I have a way that I want to kind of show that and emphasize that in Photoshop. So let me switch over to Photoshop here to just try to get this one, because value is a tough one to understand. But I think if I take a moment just to show you at least the black and white version of value. Lucy, I'm right in middle class. You need to go back to your room now. This is what happens when my wife takes long showers. I don't blame her. All right. So this photograph is a good example to show you what value is doing. And I'm going to move it to black and white so that we're going to take color out of it. But in order for us to see this a little bit more clearly, I want to open it up in the camera raw filter so that you can see this. This is the histogram. And I'll come back and try to explain this again, but when we're talking about value, I think it's the best way to start to understand one way to look at value. And I'm going to switch this to a monochromatic and taking color out of it so that I can see this piece. I wish I could zoom in on it. I don't think that I can, not with the current mouse and keyboard setup that I have. What you're looking at here is the value, the entire value of dark pixels to really, really bright pixels and everything in between. And it's being expressed in a bar graph. So that means of all the colors that are the darkest colors on this photograph, and that would probably be the trunk of the tree. If you counted them all up and then arranged them based on darkest to lightest, this would be the bar graph. So there's very, very few black and a lot of darker colors, but they're kind of spread out over this range of darks. And then the photo starts to increase the numbers of less dark pixels, and then it eases back down, and then it spikes up here. And this right here is basically a representation of all of the, almost all the way to white, but not quite white, values in this image. Right now, my guess is that that is representing the sky, because it's all almost the same color with minor variations, and there's a lot of pixels that are exactly that tone. So when you're looking at value, you can see all the values of this image. When you make an edit, and this goes back to last week, when you make an edit on a photo, you're changing the values. And if I'm shifting the values to the right, you'll see that the curve starts to shift to the right and all the pixels end up brighter. So in the case of this photo, the more I shift the values to the right, the less range there is. There's not as many different color pixels. The darks that used to be over here are now squished together over here, and all those light colors that were here are all the way to the top, almost completely overexposed. That's what I'm doing when you're overexposing, is you're shifting the value to the high side. If I went the opposite direction and shifted the values to the left, most of those pixels start to turn dark. Back in the middle is where the original photo was shot. So when you're changing exposure, you're changing all the values of all the colors. When you're changing other things, you're changing just values of, say, the dark, and just shifting the dark pixels over to the right to be brighter and be easier to see. So that would be shadows. So if you take all of the exposure edits that we talked about last week and apply them to a photo in black and white, right now we're simplifying it to black and white. This is really hopefully helping you see what you're doing when you're making that edit, because you're changing the value of all the pixels in that image to get a desired look. And again, if we just use contrast, you know, that is splitting the values further apart, hence the contrast. And contrast is a principle of design, but it's, in this case, I'm contrasting the values and pushing the darker values darker and the brighter values brighter. If it's a low contrast shot, I'm kind of squishing those values together so that there's less difference between the darkest pixel and the lightest pixel. So you can see in the curve, everything's kind of getting squished together. And that, I hope, will help you kind of understand what we're talking about when we're talking about value. You apply the same thing to color, and then you've just expanded 3 different color properties. And I'm not going to get to that right now. I just want you to understand how that works. So for example, if you're going to choose a photo to demonstrate your knowledge of value, you might want to pick one where you understand it's either all high, bright colors or dark colors. You might want to edit the contrast and talk about what you've done to that photo. Still. Wish they'd just go downstairs. This is what happens also when my older daughter doesn't have school because they're transitioning to in-person. So they're taking a couple of days off to get ready for that. Another thing I wanted to show about color, and it was right here that this photo kind of accidentally did something that I want to kind of touch on and give you a tool to use when it comes to color. These colors are complementary, and I went looking around, and the best tool that I found, and I'm going to go ahead and share this with you so you can kind of play around with it. It's going to be in the chat room. It's an Adobe Color Wheel tool. But if I wanted to find one place to really play and plan out a color scheme, this is it. There's a lot of terms here that I'm not going to get into, except to say this one right here is the one that I'm really looking at, is complementary colors. But when you're creating a color scheme, you can go monochromatic, complementary, shades, and kind of keeping all the colors in the shades, similar to the primary color that you're choosing. But for right now, I'm just going to stick with complementary colors. And this is what I like about this. When you move the tool around, you can see which colors complement each other. Green and red, yellow and purple, gold and blue, and everything in between. And you can bring that in. So for example, when I look at that photo and I see that there are some yellow tones and some dark blue tones, that is another expression of complementary colors. So again, when you start looking at the color profile, this might be a good tool to check out just to see how some of those colors go together in a photo. However, it's not necessary to understand all this. This is just a tool that I'm still trying to work into using as part of the class. So it'd be better if you use this tool to plan out, say, if I did a lesson on complementary colors, you want to choose the colors first, and then you would choose the objects that would go together. So we'll talk more about that later. Just wanted to show that because it's another way to describe and be really descriptive about colors. So that's kind of a rundown of what all of these terms mean. Well, we still haven't gotten to what it might look like in a photograph. Keep in mind that what I've done is take as many descriptive terms as I could, and that was one thing I wanted to do. So I'm going to do it right now. I'm going to take this link that I sent to you, and I'm going to add that to color, just so that you have the tool easy to find. External link. But these are here for you to help you write. And the more of them that you use, the stronger Criterion A score that you'll get for this assignment. So it's not about taking pictures. It's about showing what you know and applying it to photographs. And again, adding that to all of our language that we've practiced with the 10 photo walk, we want to get really good at describing our work. That is one of the long-term goals of this Photo 2 class. And the more that we do, the more intentional we become with our photographs. But the final website, really, there's not much new to say about that, except that you know already that how to build a website. We've gone over that. It's the same tools. Is that you'll create a page in your Photo 2 website called Elements of Design. Again, it's not the same as Element of Art. So here's how I would go through this, and here's the example that you could show. 1 or 2, either would be fine. Do we need to take? No, sorry. Karina asked, do we need 10 photos for each? No, it's 1 or 2. The writing here is really what I'm looking at the most, and how you describe your work. And that's why, again, when you're doing this assignment, you want to keep going back to the descriptive terms that I've given to you. And the more descriptive you are, the more consistent you are, meaning that you're describing each of these and not, not just one you're getting really well and the rest you're just saying, well, I'll use space, the stronger your score will be. I want to know that you're thinking about your photographs. I want to know that you're choosing good photographs for each element. That's really, really important. So I chose 2 for each, just to go in 2 different directions. And that's, again, this is where taking these concepts that apply to art and then applying them to photography is kind of the key. How does it work in our world? So with space, that's my first one. I chose this picture for positive and negative space, and I used my words to describe how these interact with this photo. I darkened the photo up so that there's really only 2 parts to it. There's mostly black or shadow, and then mostly the lit spaces, and use the pumpkin carving as a good example of positive and negative space. Whereas this one, I focused on the clutter of it. There are so many kites, and I remember that day in Lincoln City and just trying to find a way to capture as many kites in a frame as I could. So I had all these sails that kind of create a line, although I'm not discussing line. It's part of it, but it's mostly about how many different sails and kites are in this frame. And again, I use the term cluttered to describe it. So how you use this frame, or you can describe a photo in positive and negative space, just be as detailed as you can. Again, this might be a 6 or 7. 6, 7, because I got 2 images. I'm not really heavy on the writing because I did this a long time ago. Texture. So texture, again, in this photograph, texture, the main texture that's here is this cracks and the texture of the wood of the park bench. And in this photograph, I spoke a bit of the 2 textures that are prominent here, the woven texture of the sheet, and then the furry face of my ancient cat. Line, I get a bit more descriptive. And again, going back to some of these terms, I'm trying to use them and bold them, and just to show where I'm applying them. You can do that too. It's what I look for, but for students who do that, it makes it easier for me to see your effort. So if you do that and I start to notice where you're using them and start paying attention to how you're using them, it's a lot easier for me to see that you're doing what you're being asked to do, which is, again, to use these terms to describe the photos that you choose that would be good examples. So in this case, there's 2 terms that I use. One is the circular line of the pattern of the web. That's a really strong element of this photograph, but also the radiant lines that are radiating from the center of the sun. So you start to see those beams. And it's the intersection of these 2 lines that I think makes the most prominent element for this photo. Could you talk about other things? Yes, I could talk about the shape of the web, but I'm not. I'm focusing on line. So when you choose a photo, it's really helpful if you choose one where the strongest element is something that you can talk about the most. So for example, this one, thick intersecting lines. I could also talk about shapes. There's geometric shapes that are being formed by those lines. But again, I'm focusing on line for this photo because it's the strongest element of design as part of it. And I'm using it. There's that leading line leading towards the possible subject. So I've covered line, space, texture, color. Again, I showed you that wheel just to give you a tool to interpret color. But just because that's it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only way you can talk about it. What you want to talk is about the colors that are really, really important. And if color is the main element, you want to be as descriptive as you can. So in this one, obviously the vibrant red of the fall leaves is the main element. There's a little bit of green. I could talk about that. But it's kind of a monochromatic look, almost a texture photograph too. But again, I'm not talking about texture for this one. I'm choosing it for color. And this photograph was all lit. A lot of times when we're using artificial light, that's where I've seen a lot of great use of color to color the objects that are being lit, because someone has an LED light in their room and they're setting up a little stage or a studio. This was actually zoo lights. And that color was what I just noticed, is that going under that, my daughter and the look of wonder, I think, was part of what I was trying to capture. But because it was all artificial lighting, everything's that same kind of tone of purple. And it's a very, very cool, cold color versus a warm color, which would be more on the orange spectrum. Shape. Again, I tried to do 2 different examples for me and again, color could be important here too, but I'm focusing on shape because what I was really looking at was the shape of the clouds and trying to capture that in this image. And you can also see the silhouetted shapes of the lights and the shape of the hillside. That's part of it, but not the most prominent one. And if you wanted to challenge me a little bit, you can say, well, the clouds are three-dimensional. I say, yeah, I get that. I get that. But in this image, I don't really see the 3-dimension because it's all lit on one side. If it had been shaded a little bit or lit differently, might be a better example for form. But in this case, I'm looking at an organic shape and I'm commenting on it the best of my ability. So anything organic that's got a strong 2-dimensional shape, try to describe it. What was that picture about? What's most important? Whereas this one's more geometric. This is the light pattern, a series of rectangles, skinny rectangles, wide rectangles. You probably do a little bit better work describing the pattern, but again, all of these are geometric because it's light being filtered through a geometric shape of the windows and the upper section of the door. For value, I'm looking at these two photos. This is a real high contrast value where I pushed the darks darker and the lights brighter intentionally so that the entire structure, and these are shapes too. I could talk about the shapes of the birds, but I'm not. This is mostly about value. But the structure itself is almost dark black, whereas all the other elements are on the brighter end of the spectrum. I could start to talk about it as a use of space, positive and negative. But again, I'm looking mostly at the high contrast shot. Clouds are pretty good way of kind of showing a range of values. So in this photograph, there's a very wide range. You've got a lot of dark colors and a lot of very bright highlights and a lot of grays in between. So again, I'm doing my best to be very intentional about using these descriptive terms to talk about the photos that I select. The last one, form, is all about 3 dimensions. I took it, when I did mine, I took it in 2 kind of different directions. One was the form of the bubble. Now, I could say it's shaped because it's kind of a circle, but the reason I think this is a good example of form is because of the reflections. Because when you see this in motion, I did some slow motion shots of it, the form is moving, and that's even cooler because what ends up happening is the reflections move as the bubble shifts and shapes and gets blown by the wind. So if it weren't for the fact that the light was reflecting off of these and the reflections were showing some element of the contours of the bubble, it might not be a good one for form. But because it does, that's what I'm really looking at, is how it's bending the objects behind it and how the color reflecting on the surface of it are giving you hints as to what the form of this object is. And again, anything where something's being lit from a side or an angle is going to be a good one to choose for form. And then to kind of think outside the box, this one was an image of a cabin that I stayed at for the solar eclipse in Idaho. And as I was looking at it from the outside, I just realized I could see the shape of the building and it was being lit from inside. So form for this is being revealed by the light, not on the outside hitting it from an angle, but from the light on the inside, revealing some of that structure. And in doing so, you can see how deep the ceiling is. And you can see that there's a face here, even if it's mostly black. And it gives you a really good idea of the 3-dimensional shape of that object. And that's what I wrote about. So for your assignment, it's due on Friday, and we'll do other things this week. That's all I'm asking you to do, is to really take some time to look through your camera roll and to find 1 or 2 really good examples of each of these elements of design, and to spend the time to be detailed about how you try and describe it. And that's the key right there. The more of these terms you use, the more descriptive you get about the photograph, the better the example is of the photograph that you're choosing, meaning it should be a really clear example. Try not to get sidetracked like I did by talking about too many different elements at once. Just keep it simple. If it's a photograph of space, make sure that it's something that you can link to and talk about using the terms that are given here. And just focus on that. That's it for the instruction. I'm really glad that I get to have kid background for this one, but I'm going to go ahead and stop that recording.